Hi everybody and welcome to UPROAR's Halloween Tales. I don't think I'm a particularly sinister person, so perhaps the most frightening thing I can say about myself is that this orchid behind me will almost definitely be dead soon because I just killed them. Apparently I don't want to, but it just happens. But that's not much of a story. I've been asked to give a bit of a spooky story. It goes back to before I was even a safari guide. I was a 19-year-old and had only just arrived in Africa, been there for 6 months, and was working as the barman in a game lodge. And it was a wonderful time for me, surrounded by wildlife. But one of the greatest thrills was that every night we ate dinner in what's called a boma, sandy surface surrounded by large logs to make an enclosure. It's what traditionally cattle were held in. And every night at that, a hyena would arrive with her 2 youngsters. And initially they would sit quite far out, and then it got closer and closer. And eventually we realized she was using us as babysitters. She went out for her night's activities, and the 2 youngsters were there, and then they got bold enough they'd start walking around. We had to deflect them from stealing from the buffet. And they never felt particularly threatening, so we didn't do anything about their presence. What a wonderful experience for our guests. As the barman, at the end of dinner, as everything was cleaned up, I was one of the last to bed. The tourists got escorted by the safari guides to make sure they were safe in their rooms. I would tally up the stock that had been drunk, a fair amount by me, quite often, and then would make my way up to my room. And one night, I was walking up, and as it happened many times before, I found a hyena either side of me. And these youngsters were just curious, and I think they even felt some comfort from being around us. We were perhaps their protection, or at least they felt against lions, which is their main enemy. And I was walking and I thought, wow, you two are just getting big. And I knew that hyenas grow really fast. They chew on so many bones that they have the most calcium-rich milk of any animal on the planet. If you want fat in your milk, suckle a seal. If you want calcium, go to a hyena. And don't actually try that. That is not advice. I am giving disclaimers all the way through on that. And in this case, I was looking at these hyenas and you are getting big. And then I looked further ahead, and not far from the area, the workshop where the vehicles would get repaired, there were 2 more hyenas. So I took a second glance at those either side of me. I thought, these are not our babies. That's not them at all. And I knew just enough to know that you shouldn't act in any way intimidated. You shouldn't act as if you're lacking in confidence. But I did do the most casual of glances over my shoulders, and I saw 2 more behind me. So I had 2 in front, I was flanked, and 2 behind, and now I knew none of them appeared to be the 2 that I knew really well, or at least thought so. And I had no idea what to do in this scenario. Right by the workshop was a tree. The scientific name was Acacia nigrescens, but more important is its common name of the knob thorn. And sure enough, it's covered in knobs on this tree, and those knobs, for those that are thinking that they're penis shaped, they're not. They're just little bumps, golf ball sized bumps that do come to a vicious little hooked thorn. Then all the branches themselves are covered in small, vicious hooked thorns. And that was the only refuge. And I can very confidently say I've spent a lot more time as an adult in trees than I ever did as a kid. But this was the first time as an adult that I looked at a tree as a refuge. And instead of walking towards my room, which was heart-achingly close, probably a little less than 100 meters away, I just angled over to the tree, slight diagonal so that it didn't feel like a retreat. And as I got close to it, hyenas were only a few paces from me, doing that exaggerated stride they do as they're building up their own confidence. I just took a few running steps, hit that tree as hard as I could, and just climbed it. And there's no way I could have repeated that in daylight. There's no way I could have done that feat of, it does actually take strength to climb a tree, and it does take coordination, and those are 2 things I very, very rarely have in my quiver. I'm pretty convinced my parents were cousins. I'm very uncoordinated. Once fractured my collarbone running. So up the tree though, as if I had shared far more DNA with chimps than even is normally the 98% we've all agreed upon. And now I was up there. I'm pretty convinced I heard the clack of jaws right behind me. You know, that little puff of air as they got so close. I might have imagined it. But I had a nice sturdy branch and I was well out of their reach. And the hyenas were excited. And they did that wild laughter they do, which is a sound of excitement, but it's also a way they use to call in other hyenas. And I was up on a branch as if I was a leopard's prey that had already been dismembered and stashed. And I sat up there and the hyenas were milling around. They giggle and they cackle. And it's a wonderful sound when heard from a distance. It's an exciting sound. You know there's some action going on. To be the subject of that laughter would be as if you'd met the person of your dreams taking your clothes off and they cackled. That's how I felt, except it was less than a failure in the bedroom. It was potentially life-ending. And that knobthorn tree was what saved me. I was there for hours and hours and hours. I don't recall what time I'd actually set off for bed. But there is a point where you're going to fall asleep no matter what threat is around it. The adrenaline runs out and then you're exhausted. And I was getting sleepier and sleepier, but there is not a single way of getting comfortable when every single time you turn over, you become a pincushion. There was no way that I could sit comfortably. At one point, I even stood up, tried hugging the thing of the tree, and I'd heard about an amazing story of a guy, Harry Wallater, who'd taken his belt off, put it through a few loops, and put it around the tree, but the trunk was too wide. The branch I was on was just too close to the hyenas, and I didn't trust the stitching on my belt loops. Finally, in the morning, it reached this point where a little bit of light came on the horizon, and I was that gone from kooky tired to cranky tired, back to kooky to that near sobbing thing you get with absolute exhaustion. And I could see my room as the sun started rising. Next to it, the room of a really good friend of mine, Ian, and a mentor to me. Bastard clearly hadn't heard the hyena noise and thought it was worth checking out. And I sat up there and I thought, how am I going to tell them what happened? Because I was inexperienced enough to think I'd done something wrong. There's no way this would have happened if I hadn't made a mistake. And I was young enough to feel that that mattered. I didn't want to expose that I was a doofus. And as the sun rose, the hyenas, and at one point I'd counted 16, just started melting away. And years later in Botswana, I worked with people who I deeply respected as safari guides. And they could tell you the difference between a snake that was hemotoxic versus cytotoxic versus neurotoxic and the various treatments for those. And they'd still firmly believe that hyenas were shaped like this, front to back, because witches rode on them. And another one once told me firmly that witches could turn into hyenas. And if you look closely, sometimes you'll see they still have an earring in. And this is the closest I would have ever come to believing them in retrospect, was these hyenas just seemed to vanish. They were there, and then as the sun rose, they were gone. I didn't see them slink away. They just, one by one, seemed to pop into non-existence. And I looked around and there were no hyenas. And after a while, I could finally come down. And I was walking through to my room. And while I had the disadvantage of being last to bed, I was normally the last up. And out walked Ian. And he took a look and goes, "You're up early. Couldn't you sleep?" And I said, No, I couldn't. Not very well. And that's my spooky story. Happy Halloween, everybody.